Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooton Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the All Me podcast. This is Don Hooton Jr., president of the Taylor Hooton Foundation, and today I'll be your host. This episode is part one of a two-part series where my father and THF founder, Don Hooton Sr. and I will talk about Taylor's life. You will learn who Taylor was as a young boy and the events leading up to his death. And I can tell you it wasn't easy for my father and I to share Taylor's story, but it's important to us that we share that fateful day of July 15th, 2003 with you. Be sure to subscribe to the All Me podcast so you won't miss the second part of our discussion. Thanks for listening.
This morning, I'd like to introduce you to Taylor Hooton Foundation's founder, executive chairman, and my dad, Don Hooton Sr.
Hello,
Welcome,
Dono.
How are you? Thank you for doing this. I know this won't be an easy discussion for the two of us, but I think it's important for people to know about Taylor and more about his life. So let's kind of start with just telling us more about Taylor and what was he like as a kid growing up. At the time, I was only 5 years old when he was born. So tell us about his young life.
Well, Taylor was born in Birmingham, Alabama. Work took me there. I was with the telephone company at the time. And like, any other kid, just a lot of crying and a lot of diapers to clean in the early days. But as he began to grow up even a little bit, his personality began to develop. And from the very early days, Taylor was what we call a character. I mean, a joker, gregarious, always smiling, always laughing. He quickly became the family clown at the dinner table, always had stories for us or jokes to tell. He was just a very likable, loosely wrapped young man from the very beginning.
Yeah, I remember always joking, calling him character, even up until when he was in high school. And I kind of go back to remembering as a kid, and we moved all over the place. I was born in Louisiana, and then ultimately, we moved to Alabama, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Florida. And then I'll never forget the day I graduated from high school and the moving truck was being loaded up. And we're on our way to Texas, where we are today. So take us back to moving to Texas as Taylor began middle school and getting into high school.
Well, in hindsight, Taylor had more difficulty adjusting, I think, to moving to Texas. He was just beginning high school, junior high. It's never easy as a kid to move like that, as I know you'll relate to. And I moved a lot when I was a young man. But he fit right in here, quickly made friends. As several of the kids told us, once he got settled in, he took ownership of reaching out to other new kids that were moving into the area. We, lived in Plano, Texas, which at the time was, and to some extent still is, an extremely fast-growing area. So there were always new kids coming into the school, and Taylor was the type of kid that would reach out and introduce himself, welcome these kids into school, and make sure that they got introduced around to all of the kids in the school. Plano was a very fast-paced community, and what I mean by that, it's certainly all at least middle class with a whole lot of really high-end, bordering on wealthy families living here. So there's a lot of competition amongst the adults and even amongst the kids on how they live, what kind of car they drive, what kind of clothes they wear. And Taylor, as a competitive kid in sports, as we'll talk about in a little bit, but even in life, was from the very early days here trying to compete and finding ways to fit in with the faster-paced crowd here in Plano.
Yeah, I'll never forget driving by the high school there in Plano when we first moved here, wondering if it was the teacher's lot or a used luxury car lot. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I do remember Taylor having a ton of friends, even some that we still keep in touch with today. But how was Taylor's grades when he was in middle school and high school?
Taylor was always a good student. I think it helped because he was such a gregarious, friendly kid. He always had wonderful relationship with his teachers. They were telling stories before and after our loss with Taylor about what a fine young man he was and how he was such a key portion of their classes. But he always made great grades. At the time we lost Taylor, in between his junior and senior year, he was shouldering a 3.8 grade average. He was very competitive and was getting ready to do his ACT tests, all the things that are required to go on and compete for college grades. But he's an excellent student, always did well in school.
I never forget, and it's always, kind of fun to reminisce, but my older sister, Mackenzie, I'm a middle child, and Taylor was my younger brother. I always had to work really, really hard for grades where it seemed it always came easy for Taylor in the classroom to remember what he was being taught and test taking, which, I guess that gene got passed on to him and not me. So he was always a good kid in high school. Let's kind of shift gears for a minute, because this is something that even today, young people are still being told. But at some point along the way, Taylor was playing baseball, and his high school coach, like so many of our adult influencers do, even to this day, told Taylor that he needed to get bigger, stronger, and faster if he wanted to make the varsity team. Can you kind of talk more about the conversation the coach had with Taylor and kind of elaborate on Taylor's size and how that might have brought him to using anabolic steroids?
Sure, I can. Taylor was not what I'd call a big kid, but a tall kid. He was the tallest amongst everyone in the family. He was 6'1", 6'2" tall. When I say not big, he hadn't filled out yet. He was a junior in high school. But his baseball coach, like you said, Donald, told he and one of his good friends, Mark, that they needed to get bigger to make the varsity team. Now, at 6'2", at the time, I think he was about between 180 and 185 pounds. I guess that's big enough.
Yeah, it's pretty
Certainly big enough to throw a baseball. He was primarily a pitcher on the team, but he wanted to be the number one pitcher. And if coach says you need to get bigger, Taylor was going to do what it took to get bigger. And I don't believe for 1 second that the coach was inferring, suggesting, encouraging Taylor to turn to anabolic steroids or anything else illicit in order to achieve his objective. He was just encouraging them to get bigger. Of course, as we've learned, there's not much a kid at 16 years old can do to get bigger on their own. And the coach didn't show him how to get bigger. The coach wasn't trained on exercise regimens or dietary regimens. He just knew that what a coach needed to do was encourage the kids to get bigger. And what the coach did not know was that when Taylor went back to the baseball field, fully half of the kids on Taylor's baseball team were already injecting themselves with real anabolic steroids. So Taylor didn't need to look far, figure out how the other boys had achieved the coach's objectives of getting bigger. And I don't make that statement of saying half of the boys were using lightly. As you might imagine, after we lost Taylor, the other parents of the kids on the team were extremely upset, came to talk to us, and after learning what we'd been through, took our suggestions to go back and search the kids' closets and chest of drawers and have discussions with the kids. And there were 15 boys rostered on the team, and there were 8 of the families, including Taylor, that admitted that their young boys had been using anabolic steroids. That is much, much, much more common even today than most people listening to this podcast can ever imagine. There are just so many of our kids that are using this stuff, but we'll talk about that later. So Taylor began using anabolic steroids, as best we can tell, in January of his junior year in high school, was when this illicit behavior started. Of course, we knew nothing about it, but it was going on right there in the house.
It is still going on today, and I don't believe coaches and adult influencers mean harm when they tell a young person, whether male or female, to get bigger, stronger, faster, to lose weight. I don't believe there's any ill intent there. It's just something that's been driven into our heads for so many years. But this was 15 years ago, and even today, more kids are image conscious, body conscious, posting their selfies on Instagram and Snapchat. And we're just more aware of what our bodies look like. Just some of the advice that we'll give along the way is, especially as an adult influencer of any kind, be very careful before talking with a kid about changing their physical appearance. And if you do, be prepared to give that child and young person some form of expert guidance on how to achieve their goals without the use of drugs.
Donald, I'll make the same point, but a little bit stronger than you did. As a veteran of 15 years of this battle, I would instruct a coach or a parent, don't ever tell your young person that they need to get bigger unless you're trained to show them how to get bigger, what proper diet and exercise. And I'm not talking about just trained does not mean how my coach taught me when I was a kid. Trained means professional training on how to accomplish these objectives.
Like a sports dietitian, strength coach, somebody that's been to school and has a background of education. And me at the time, I mean, I've got a personal story that goes along with it as well, because I remember telling you and Mom at some point when I was in college, and I was a freshman in college at the time, I was playing Division I baseball, and Taylor called me one night and he told me that he had been thinking about and started using anabolic steroids. I really didn't know much about the drug. We heard about it in school and some of the side effects. You know, you get a whole 15 minutes in your health class about it. But with little knowledge about what was going on and it being a topic that we never talked about in school, I had no concept that these drugs were dangerous. At the time, more than half of the guys on my team were using anabolic steroids, and it was very tempting for me, especially as a college athlete and somebody that wanted to improve their appearance and achieve what I guess society would tell us is perfection. So, you know, Taylor did tell me that he had begun to use these drugs, and I remember coming to talk to you guys about it and kind of tell us, and I'm sure you remember the conversation, but when I came to you guys and told you that he was using steroids, at that time, I mean, what sort of behavior changes were you seeing, some of the side effects that he might have had, and even any doctor's visits that you took him on?
Well, I think it's important to point out that, yes, you told us, but this was months after Taylor began using anabolic steroids. What we talked about at the time, that was, you know, the secret pact between two brothers. Younger brother confides in older brother. Older brother wouldn't risk giving up the younger brother to report to the parents what was going on early. And it's just, that's the way it is. But back to your question, we noticed a number of things about Taylor physically and emotionally, but it's important to point out we noticed them in hindsight. Today, looking back, it's easy to see the symptoms that Taylor was showing, but as ignorant may be the wrong word, unaware, we were uneducated like 99% of the people that are listening to us about the side effects of anabolic steroids. I mean, we knew they were against the rules in professional sports. We knew they were illegal, but had no idea what they really can do to the body and the mind. But the first things, you know, in hindsight, I remember noticing were Taylor developed a bad case of acne on his back, which is classical sign of steroid use. Me and his mom just thought that that was another teenager growing up. Yeah. But the acne was so bad that his mom took him to the dermatologist to have him treated, to get his Accutane or whatever the other drugs were at the time that they were treating acne with. Parenthetically, let me just point out that the dermatologist didn't equate or express any concern about the acne that had exploded on his back. There was also, as Taylor began putting on weight during this period after January, in the spring, Taylor put on about 30 pounds of what was almost pure muscle. He really began to get bigger. And we noticed that, but we equated it with the workouts that he was doing at the local YMCA. We knew he was working hard there. We knew he was taking some dietary supplements. And we reinforced the behavior, told him how good he looked. By the way, the doctors have told us since then it is not possible for a young person that age at 16 years old to achieve that kind of muscle gain using dietary supplements and working out at the Y.
Yeah, it's
there was
impossible.
obviously, to the trained eye, something that was going on, and we saw it. We just didn't know what was at the root of it. Along with the weight gain, Taylor developed a puffiness. It was a puffy face and puffy neck. We look back at the pictures of Taylor at the time, and you could see it. It wasn't just muscle there, but that comes, as we later learned, from the water retention, that the anabolic steroids cause the body to retain water. So part of the weight is water weight, and where you can see it is in the face and in the neck. Had we looked closer, we probably would have seen it in the ankles and the feet and in the wrists, but we weren't focused on that. It was just looking at his face and his neck, you could see it. That and some more physical changes should have been obvious to us, but they weren't. What was obvious and what did cause us concern, that again we didn't relate to anabolic steroids, were the behavior changes. And anabolic steroids are artificial testosterone. We all expect a 15 or 16-year-old to act weird and to go through mood swings, but we had no concept of the kind of mood swings that Taylor would experience. From euphoria, from smiling and laughing like the old Taylor, to depression and aggressive behavior, roid rage. Let's just talk about the roid rage for a minute. Taylor, as we talked earlier, took his schoolwork seriously and would work in my office trying to multitask. He'd be studying on the one hand and he'd be working the chat rooms, which was the high tech of the time, carrying on. Used to admire him, 6 or 8 active conversations on the computer. Yeah. But his mom would go in to see him about 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night and say, "Taylor, it's a school night. It's time to get off the computer," and have to go back a second time and say, "Taylor, get off the computer now." And on more than one occasion, Taylor would slam his fist down onto the desk. In one case, remember now, he's a pitcher, took his pitching hand and shoved it right through the sheetrock wall in my office and damaged his hand to the point that we took him to an orthopedic surgeon to examine it to make sure he hadn't broken his knuckles, which he hadn't. This was a gregarious, friendly kid who would immediately storm upstairs and then 15 minutes later would come down mostly with tears in his eyes and apologize to his mom and me for his behavior, promising always that it would never happen again, but steroids do their nasty on you, and he would do it again, get in trouble again, and that was just, again, in hindsight, which is always 2020, one of the key signs that should have told us that Taylor was mixed up with some bad stuff.
So a couple of comments you made, including that closing comment there that it should have been obvious, and you said what wasn't obvious to us. Now looking back, what would you tell a current adult influencer, somebody that's around these kids today, a parent that might have a child that's acting a little bit different? Because what the listeners have to also understand is you had already raised Mackenzie. She had been through the whole puberty mood swing. She was our older sister. She was, I believe at the time, getting her master's degree. I was freshman, sophomore in college. I had already gone through all that mess growing up and, mood swings and all that. Was there something different about Taylor? Is there some advice that you could provide a listener? How would you handle it differently? Where would you go to get information? What other questions might you have asked at that time?
Knowing what I know now, and now we get into kind of the purpose for the work that we do, Donald, is parents, coaches, guidance counselors, teachers need to be aware that the use of anabolic steroids is widespread, more widespread. I could curl your hair with stories about the widespread usage. And of course, it's morphed now from just the athletes primarily to where now athletes are a minority. It's just kids wanting to look better. The first thing is to be aware that this is a problem, and most parents aren't. And even if they are aware that it's a problem, they would be like us. And I can relate to this, not my kid. My kid wouldn't do this. I've talked to my kid about this, and they swear to me that it's not going on. And no, I don't have any friends that are doing it. And by the way, If your kid's telling you that they don't know anybody that's doing it or it's not going on, your antenna ought to go up because they know better. All of them know better. And that's a pretty overstatement, but it's more true than it's not. It's awareness. It's having your antenna up and educating yourself, having a group like us in to talk to adults and kids so that when the behavior or physical changes begin to happen, that you know to come to a website like ours or to the medical websites that will tell you that anabolic steroids or other like drugs may be at the bottom of it. You got to be aware that it's going on. And our job as a foundation is to raise that awareness so there's a consciousness and parents know to look for it. And when they see it, at least get their antenna up that this is what it might be.
Yeah, and one of the things that we'll do following this, and we'll talk more about this as we continue our discussion, but we'll post links to various websites in the show notes. So if you are interested in learning more and you need more information, you can find them in the show notes following the podcast. Let's move on to a little bit more difficult subject to discuss. This will probably be the hardest discussion we have throughout the podcast. And I know it's not the easiest thing to talk about, but I feel, and I know you feel, and our family feels that it's important for people who are listening and hear our message about what our family went through on Tuesday, July 15th, 2003. Do you kind of want to start talking about the day? And then I'm happy to share where I was because I was not home that day, if you recall.
Well, let me start the day before. We had caught, it's a long story, I won't go into all of it. Let's just say we had caught Taylor. Taylor stole, and I'm not proud of this, but it's the truth and it's important that people hear it. Taylor had stolen a laptop and a couple of items that went with it. And Taylor, as far as we know, had never stolen anything before, but we found out why had he stolen it. He needed to raise some money to buy more anabolic steroids. Just like we see on TV or hear about with other drugs, whether it be heroin or all the other stuff, you need money to be able to keep your habit going, and Taylor got into that circle. The reason I mention that is when we discovered Taylor's theft, we punished him, just like I would hope that most parents listening to this would. And what we did was ground him for 2 weeks. It upset him tremendously. He had a girlfriend, had made plans to do some stuff with her. This was summertime during the 2-week period, and pleaded with his mom. When he got up the next morning after the punishment, of course, as the disciplinarian, I got to mete out the punishment. And I should note also, we did it in a family environment.
Yeah.
Donald was at school remotely, as was Mackenzie, but we had everybody on the speakerphone because stealing stuff is just not part of our family values. And everybody felt strongly enough about it that we talked to Taylor together. And I meted out the punishment. And the next morning, Taylor woke up still upset, appealed to his mom. Can I just take this as a warning? And she said, no, not now. We can talk to your dad when he gets home, but I'm not going to lift the grounding.
Yeah.
We live in a 2-story house, and Taylor went upstairs. Mackenzie called, and she was back in town and wanted to bring some lunch over for she and her mom and Taylor. So she was going to stop and get some sandwiches and says, what do you guys want to eat? Her mom called upstairs to Taylor, and he didn't answer. And she called again another couple of times and got concerned and went upstairs to his bedroom and found him hanging on the door in his bedroom. And she called 911. They talked her through doing CPR, which she still has nightmares about, as anyone might imagine. And that was the end. That was the end.
I could only imagine the nightmares. I mean, I still have some myself because, again, at the time, I was in Philadelphia. That's where I was going to college. I was playing baseball. I was going to school up there. And I'm glad you went back the night before. I had almost forgotten about that phone call and the need to be on that phone call. I'll never forget where I took that phone call. And I was tired because if you remember, Mackenzie and we flew, I believe, out of Heathrow, connected in Chicago, and it was a red eye coming back. And I don't believe had ever been on a red eye before. You know, you swear you're never going to take another one. And here we are 15 years later, still taking a few of them a year. I was tired, but I remember I had to get up that morning to I believe it was bring a truck back to work because I wasn't going to go into work that morning. I was just going to sleep in and then go to baseball practice later that afternoon. And for whatever reason, I had, probably just being tired, I'd left my cell phone in the apartment on accident. And I just remember returning home that morning and I opened the phone and I had multiple missed calls from Mackenzie. And that's kind of when I figured, why would she call me so many times? It was on that call when the word she told me was Taylor hung himself. I try to share that story when we're out doing programs because I think it's important for people to understand just how quickly life can end and that, mental health is a problem and it's something that we need to be openly talking about. It's not an easy day. And here we are 15 years later, still impacting young lives. But one of the things that people always ask me, and I know you and I have discussed this personally, I think it's something that's important for listeners to hear. Taylor passes away July 15, 2003. And to this day, I'm still inspired and really don't know how you had the courage to share Taylor's story just weeks after his funeral. Can you just tell us what it was like delivering the first program? And did the school reach out to you? How did you prepare for? How did you find the courage to go in and share something that was so fresh? How did you find the courage to do that?
It was easy in one sense. I know that sounds crazy, but Taylor's bedroom, when he passed and the police came, became a crime scene. That's kind of ridiculous, but that's what procedures are. Nobody's allowed in or out while the police go through to make sure that it was what it appeared to be, that there wasn't any foul play. During their investigation upstairs, one of the senior detectives came downstairs and said, "Mr. Hooton, did you know Taylor was using steroids?" And I said, well, his brother had told us that at one point he was thinking about using steroids, but we weren't for certain he had been using, or now that I'm freshing up, we found out he was using this, but he told us he'd stopped.
Yeah.
And the policeman, it wasn't what he said, but how he said it. It was clear that the officer had already equated Taylor's use of steroids with the suicide that had just happened. My mind just went crazy over the next days and couple of weeks. I reported back to work. I was working at HP at the time, and of course I couldn't focus on work. I was working the internet, trying to learn as much as I could about the connection between anabolic steroids and suicide. And lo and behold, as you read through the medical literature and the commentaries of the experts, it was right there in black and white. And I knew that we were unaware of what the connection was. And because we were such friends with the other parents on Taylor's team, I knew that they were unaware. Because if they were, we would have been talking about it while we were sitting in the bleachers watching the games. I knew they were just as oblivious as we were. So I just felt compelled as early as Taylor's wake to speak out. I remember making a comment to one of the leaders of our Sunday school class, Southern Baptist, and talking with Alan Jordan at the time about feeling called to do something about Taylor's suicide. And I became equipped over the next 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks, to more knowledgeably understand and be able to articulate what had happened. And I approached the principal there at Plano West Senior High School, where Taylor had gone to school, to see if it might be possible to address the parents there at Plano West about what had happened so that they would be more knowledgeable. Reluctantly at first, the principal acquiesced and scheduled an assembly, which was about 6 weeks after Taylor died, to back up and make sure there was some science behind what I was going to say. They reached out to Cooper Clinic, which is a very, very famous medical facility here in Dallas. And the president of Cooper Clinic joined me at the podium and gave the medical assessment in technical medical terms or scientific terms about what these drugs are and what they do to the body and the mind. And unbeknownst to us, someone, and I still don't know who, by the way, there were about 300 I don't remember, 600 anyway. There were quite a few folks. The auditorium was packed, whatever the capacity of the auditorium is. And sitting in the audience was a reporter from the Dallas Morning News. Didn't know that he was in the audience, Tim McMahon, and he took notes, and it took him several weeks before he published his article. And in hindsight, I think I finally figured out why it took him so long. I think they wanted to figure out before they published that this connection was real, that this wasn't either some lunatic father in the suburbs of Plano or a kid with an alcohol problem or other drugs or a girlfriend problem. They wanted to make sure before they published that this was a real story. And of course, they've learned since that it was. So they published a major story in the Dallas Morning News about that presentation and about Taylor's story. 2 days later, the phone rings, and I'll never forget the phone call. Gentleman introduced himself, says, "My name is Amiel Weisvogel. I'm with CBS 60 Minutes. I guess you know why I'm calling." And that set in motion. 60 Minutes did a story on what had happened to Taylor, followed by the New York Times. A reporter came down and spent 3 days investigating the claims and comments and legitimacy of our story. And they did a front page sports report, a major story in the New York Times. And we thought we had just walked into a local problem on the Plano West baseball team. And what we had walked into was exposing the nation, and that's not an overstatement, but exposing the nation to an epidemic. And I don't use that word lightly, an epidemic of anabolic steroid and performance-enhancing substance use that's going on amongst the youth of our country. And I had the opportunity this week to sit down with ex-commissioner of Major League Baseball, Bud Selig, on an unrelated matter. And he was reminding me at some point I made a comment about the number of lives that we've touched. And he was commenting about how much bigger impact that we've had and how important this is to our nation and how Major League Baseball has stepped forward, all as a result of this, to help address this problem. And it's bigger now, sad to say, than it was when we lost Taylor.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooton Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.